Welcome to the Grayzone. It's Max Blumenthal. According to the terms of a new coalition deal that will bring Benjamin Netanyahu back into the Israeli Prime Minister's office, open Jewish supremacists and acolytes of fascist Rabbi Meir Kahane will be part of the new Israeli government. They include Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionism Party, a figure who supports Israeli hospitals and doctors denying care to non-Jews and favors religious segregation between Jews and Arabs. Smotrich will take over the civil administration of the Occupied Palestinian Territories, making him de facto prime minister of the West Bank. Then there's Itamar Ben-Gvir of the Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Strength Party, a religious nationalist legal activist who has been convicted of crimes against Palestinians, has led race riots against Palestinian civilians, and who will become the national security minister in Netanyahu's incoming government. So to talk about the implications of these figures' inclusion in cabinet-level security positions, we're going to talk to David Sheen, who's based in Haifa, Israel, and has spent years researching the ideology and activities of the Kahanist movement in Israel and abroad. So, David, welcome to the Grayzone. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Max. Good to be here.
I hope that intro was accurate about these figures. And I'm correct that Itamar Ben-Gvir has been convicted of terrorism-related crimes.
He's been convicted of incitement to terrorism, and he has a decades-long history. He's been charged dozens of times, convicted sometimes, but all along he's been one of the younger leaders of this movement, the Kahane movement, that is, for all intents and purposes, the vanguard of Israeli politics, the furthest right movement. And more to the point, they're kind of a combination of the nationalism and the religious theocrats on one hand, on the other hand, and the mishmash of the two turns them into a messianist movement. What I mean by that is a group that, like the religious, they want Israel to be ethnically cleansed of all non-Jews, not just an apartheid state from the river to sea, but an ethnically cleansed one. But unlike the religious, they're not waiting for God to do that. They're not passively just praying and studying Torah and waiting for that to come into some future messianic era. They, like the secular nationalists, believe that it's for them to change the facts on the ground and make that vision a reality. So since Meir Kahane, kind of the founding father of Israeli fascism, inspired by Israel's victory, conquering in 1967, Six-Day War, conquering so much territory, West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, tripling plus its territory. For Kahane and many others, they felt that this was now the Messianic era. Israel it can't be conquered. It is now, doesn't have to take into account any other factors. And so this is when they roll out their messianic vision. And Kahane first starts out in America with his vision of Jewish exceptionalism and has a whole career of Jewish terrorism there. But a few years later, he moves to Israel, starts a political party, and really changes Israeli politics forever by breaking a taboo on openly inciting ethnic cleansing, something, of course, many Israeli leaders had spoken about, written about, and practiced in some cases, in the Nakba certainly, and in some cases afterwards. But here, you have a politician who openly incited that and asked people to vote for him on the basis of he will practice ethnic cleansing, he will ethnically cleanse the country's non-Jews.
My answer, to transfer the Arabs out of this country.
By force?
Hopefully through compensation and their willingness to leave.
If compensation doesn't work and they're not willing?
Through force. The same kind of force that the Poles and the Czechs used against the ethnic Germans in 1945, when after having suffered at the hands of a fifth column, which brought in Hitler, they decided in their own way never again.
Can you believe that would be the final solution to the Palestinian problem?
I'm not talking about final solutions. I'm talking about a problem that has to be solved. If they're in this country, they will vote the Jews out of a state. If they're outside of the country, they will hate us from the outside. And I'd rather have a distant hating neighbor than a close one.
Okay, so this is Meir Kahane, the late Meir Kahane, who is the inspiration for Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionism Party and Itamar Ben-Gvir of the Jewish Strength Party, who will both serve important security positions in this incoming coalition government. So before we get deeper into their ideology and the ideology of Kahanism, what do you think it means for this government that they are in charge of security issues in the West Bank, especially at a time of heightened conflict? I mean, dozens and dozens of Palestinian men are being killed in the West Bank. There's a lot of resistance against the occupation forces there. And the Israeli Army Chief of Staff, Gadi Eisenkot, has said that their appointment could actually lead the Israeli army to break apart. So from your point of view, what are the implications of them achieving these new security-related powers?
Well, it's interesting. It seems that what Netanyahu is doing at the behest of his coalition partners, of course, he's indebted to them because he's trying to stay out of jail. He's up on corruption charges, and because he needs them very badly to change Israeli law and to get him to end his trial so that he won't have to spend his final years in jail, he has to accept every condition that they put for him. And that condition has included, as the former Chief of Staff Eisenkot alluded, it includes the breakup of the Israeli government. Its traditional breakup of ministries is now being parsed into different portions, and some of those portions, very specific portions, are going to be handled by, as you pointed out, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir of the Messianic camp, of these further far-right parties, and they have specifically chosen those offices because it would give them the ability, well, in the case of Smotrich, to essentially de facto, as you said, annex the West Bank, or at least Area C of the West Bank, because it would give him the power to make all the decisions there, but with maintaining the legal fiction that this is annexing, but without actually using the word annexing. But in all other ways, it would be annexing. And in terms of Itamar Ben-Gvir wanting securely related, well, think about it. A year and a half ago, Israel had what we would call anti-Palestinian pogroms or race riots in the so-called mixed cities, traditionally historic Palestinian cities that were depleted of most of their original inhabitants, but still a Palestinian minority hung on, and still is today a rare Palestinian minority city in 48 Israel. And in those territories, in those towns rather, in 2021, Itamar Ben-Gvir's thugs came into those towns and attacked Palestinians whenever they could find them. And so Israel's police chief accused Itamar Ben-Gvir of inciting what he called the Jewish Intifada. That's a year and a half ago. Today, Itamar Ben-Gvir is now being appointed to National Security Minister, so he's going to be the boss of that Israeli police commissioner who blamed him for those race riots. And
that's amazing.
And
let me just to illustrate who Ben-Gvir is for those who don't know. Here's video of him. I think this was in 2015, leading a race riot in occupied Hebron in the Old City. Ben-Gvir is the man in white. You can actually see Ben-Gvir to the left of the screen pulling down the rack of clothes and vandalizing the shop of a Palestinian shopkeeper in Hebron. So that was actually a shop that I visited in 2018. I was just passing by. The shopkeeper is in the H2 area of Hebron, which is under Israeli military occupation, because Ben-Gvir lives there along with other fascistic settlers. There's a memorial to Baruch Goldstein, who massacred 29 Palestinian worshippers at the Ibrahimi Mosque nearby in order to destroy the Oslo Accords. Ben-Gvir actually dressed up as Baruch Goldstein as a young man to kind of honor him. And here he is leading a riot. Yeah, I mean, I hung out with that shopkeeper. He was a really nice, warm, hospitable person, and they're telling him to go back to Syria, assaulting him. And this rioter is now a national security minister in the Israeli government. And you're saying he has also led riots inside what's considered Israel proper, and he'll have police powers.
Exactly. So even beforehand, police were generally known, especially the border police that Itamar Ben-Gvir is now specially requested control over. So they're already generally known as strong bastions of Kahanism, that the people who serve in those units are brawlers and tend to the far right politically. But now it's just openly, police understand that this is the spirit of the commander. So we can imagine that they're going to be even more brutal on what few people will still protest in the streets. But what we'll see more of course, is people who share the Kahanist ideology understanding that there won't be any intervention, and that they can feel free to take out their anger on Palestinian people or other non-Jews that they encounter. That's what we can expect in the years to come. You mentioned that Ben-Gvir, for example, dressed up as the biggest mass murderer in Israeli history, Baruch Goldstein. He also, the first date with his wife was there. He is recently, a few years ago, called for streets in Israel to be named after him. It's the whole ideology of the Kahane movement. They believe what makes them different from the rest of the Israeli terrorists is that they don't believe what to do, we're the lords of the land, and sometimes these Palestinians are going to rise up, so we need to crush it. No. The Kahanists actually consecrate killing Palestinians and people that they say are their enemies, which is pretty much anyone that defies their rules. So they actually hold these people up to be heroes. Ben-Gvir had a photo of Goldstein, the murderer, the mass murderer, on his living room wall for decades. I mean, they literally hold these people up as heroes. And in some cases are. Ben-Gvir actually, as we mentioned in a podcast some years ago that we did, Ben-Gvir is actually the protege of a Kahanist killer, of Bronx-born Andy Green, moved to Israel, became the Kahanist terrorist turned lawyer, Baruch Ben Yosef. When Ben-Gvir graduated from street rabble-rouser to studying to law, to be able to practice law and defend Israel's Kahanist killers, then he learned from the best, the Kahanist killer turned lawyer, Baruch Ben Yosef, Andy Green, and did his articling with Ben Yosef. And thanks to that, now Ben-Gvir has his law degree and is now managed to parlay that into a political career, and as you said, making him essentially police minister in charge of Israel's police forces.
Right, and let's look at how some of this is potentially going to play out. These are scenes from Hebron, I think about a week ago, where some soldiers are beating peace activists. And here's one, I think he's about to get slammed to he was just slammed to the ground and arrested. So pay attention to this soldier who just walked by. You can see they're now beating him. And then they go ahead and arrest him. He's just basically standing around. But this is the significant part, is this soldier is now taunting peace activists.
נגמר עם כל מה שאתה עושה פה, כל הבית זונות שאתה הולך לעשות. מה אני עושה? נגמר. אני עושה משהו נגד החוק? אתה עושה הכל נגד החוק. אני קובע מה החוק ואתה עושה פה נגד החוק. לך אחורה.
So David, you speak Hebrew, so what's he saying?
Yeah, it's a really funny clip. First of all, the person who's filming is Issa Amro, a Palestinian in
Right.
Hebron, and so the soldier is telling him, this is it. Very soon, we're gonna take care of you. That's it. Gloves off. We're gonna really get into you any minute now. Ben-Gvir's coming into power. Just you wait. And Issa Amro saying, what am I doing? I'm just standing here. I'm not doing anything illegal. What? Everything you do is illegal. I tell you what's illegal and what's not. And essentially, what is to me comes out of this video when paired with the description of the people who were there, those peace activists you showed in the first video, describing the interaction from their perspective. A really amusing picture emerges, because that soldier who was so triggered, who made those comments, apparently what preceded the filming was a group of American tourists crowding around him and singing and dancing with him. So in the middle of occupying the largest Palestinian city in the southern West Bank, a group of, not certain if they were Jewish Zionists or Christian Zionists, but just all of a sudden start dancing around him. And then when some of these leftist Jews noticed from the side what was happening and saw the apartheid reality in Hebron and made a comment like this is apartheid or whatever word they said, that broke his whole veneer, that all of a sudden he was so triggered by that, and that he was so enraged by this. I just found it astounding that's is so-called the strongest army in the the most powerful army, we think of these Israeli soldiers and this vision of what an Israeli soldier is, and essentially, and that just the very idea that someone could not see him as some kind of demigod, here to save the Jewish people, is so triggering to him that he freaked out about it, and eventually actually sat in jail for 10 days. That was his punishment. I mean, I'm sure that if it wouldn't have been on the cameras, then he wouldn't have had any punishment, but he was actually punished for those.
Well, and the supporters of Ben-Gvir and company are outraged that he was punished at all. I mean,
naturally, of course, and this is what you mentioned before about Israel's former chief of staff alluding to, that there's a questioning today of traditional assumptions about the Israeli army. There are a lot of ideas about what the Israeli army is supposed to be, but the new vision is that it's not just a sectarian army, but a religious sectarian army. In recent years, we have more and more people from this messianic camp entering the powerful positions in the army, to the point where this is the final stage, where it's in all senses, it's not just it's kind of on every level. They made this a specific plan of the far right to capture powerful positions in the army, but also in education, and also in the media, and also in politics, in the sense of the most powerful, the largest political party in Israel, the Likud party. Don't forget, after Kahane, the original founding father of the Kahanism movement, of the Messianic movement, after he first found success and was elected to the Israeli Knesset in the mid-1980s, it was actually Israel's ruling Likud party who then passed a law that made Kahane ineligible to run for Knesset, saying, okay, if you're that racist, openly inciting ethnic cleansing and calling for ethnic cleansing, then that's a step too far. And at that point, even Israel's right-wing Zionists stepped in and made Kahane's party ineligible to run for the Knesset, for Israel's parliament. So that's when the Kahanists realized, if we are going to come back into Israeli politics and rehabilitate ourselves politically, we're going to also need, on the way, to infiltrate the Likud party and take it over from within. And they did that starting in the beginning of the 21st century, using a faction called the Jewish Leadership Faction of Moshe Feiglin, was the Kahanist who stood in front of it and led that faction. But it was started by old school Kahanist Seth Sackett from New York City. And so these Kahanists worked from within, and the Likud party started out as a small faction, increased their power base, after a few years, you have people who didn't even come up with them, who weren't even Kahanists to begin with, but now starting to kiss up to them and trying to find favor in their eyes, to the point where today it's almost indistinguishable. You have Likud lawmakers who used to be Kahanists, Kahanist lawmakers who, go just back and forth between the two parties, and some of the incitement coming out of their mouths, it's almost indistinguishable to know who came from Jabotinsky and who came from Kahana. That's where we're at today, and they managed to do so. They managed to take over those top spots to the point where they don't have a majority, but they have a plurality. And this Netanyahu government will be the most religious government in Israel's history. It's more than half religious, almost 2/3 religious in terms of the government itself. So
well, along with the ultra-Orthodox parties.
That's right, the Orthodox parties.
And I guess it shows what it takes for Netanyahu to cobble together a coalition, which makes him, as Gideon Levy, the Haaretz columnist, put it, the sort of voice of moderation, which shows how far to the right Israeli politics have gone.
Very much so. Definitely, Netanyahu is, you'd say that he's the centrist in his bloc.
And let's talk about Smotrich, because he is arguably going to be more influential than Ben-Gvir as presiding over the civil administration and gov't, which determines what goes in and out of the Gaza Strip from at least the Israeli side. I mean, explain what the civil administration is and what Smotrich's agenda for the Palestinians is. You've called it the ABC plan.
Well, first of all, one word I'll say that Smotrich is almost no less of a Kahanist than Ben-Gvir, in the sense that, first of all, he started up the Komemiyut group, which is basically a think tank, a Kahanist think tank led by a top Kahanist Rabbi Dov Lior. Smotrich's father is a follower of Dov Lior, so they are Kahanists through and through. And as
Dov Lior was the rabbi who essentially issued a fatwa against Yitzhak Rabin that provided religious justification for his assassination, and even gave a personal blessing, or his Rabin's assassin was a acolyte of Dov Lior.
And not only that, but also he praised that Israel's biggest mass murderer, Baruch Goldstein, the Kahanist Baruch Goldstein, he praised him as holier than all the martyrs of the Holocaust. So this is Kahanism through and through. And as you said, the ABC plan that Smotrich proposes for the Palestinians, and this is on the table. If you actually go back to the roles and you read what Kahane proposed in his time, it was almost word for word. And essentially, that proposal comes down to three options. This is the three options I would give Palestinian. I said A, B, or C. A is apartheid. You can choose to remain in Israel, but as a lower status. There's no question of voting rights. There's you will be literally a slave, and you will be forced to do labor, and that you will have subhuman status, but you can live here under apartheid conditions. That's A. B is bribe. Your other option is you can leave the country, and if you choose to pick up your stuff and move somewhere else, you will get a bribe. You will get money from the Israeli government to do so, to pick up your stuff and go. C, the third option, is cleansing. If you don't agree to live as inferior, and you don't agree to take the money and run, then we're going to ethnically cleanse you. We're going to fight you to the death and kill you. And so that's Smotrich's plan. Of course, he doesn't use those words, but that's the exact framework, and it's the same as Kahana. And this is the proposal that he's made. So now, what you mentioned, that he's going to be tasked with a lot of the powers of the civil administration, and this is the aspect of the Israeli government, or the Israeli military rather, that West Bank Palestinians are basically living under, because they're living under military occupation. So it's not the Israeli government that rules them using civil laws, but only military laws. Now, Smotrich, now that he's got this much power and leverage over Netanyahu, he's demanding all the aspects of the government, all the aspects of the military that will give him control over the lives of Palestinians. So For example, he will be able to punish Palestinians who build without permits, without his permission. And of course, he will appoint the people that make the decisions of what's permitted and not permitted and how they come to those decisions. Of course, he will also appoint the people who will make the same decisions about Jewish building in the West Bank. And so he will ensure that, all the Jews who want to construct homes, it doesn't matter whether that land is so-called state land or whether it is the privately owned by individual Palestinians, Smotrich will ensure that every Jew who wants to build will be able to get official Israeli approval and, of course, all the amenities that come with that, whether it's the infrastructure that the state supplies. So it's incredibly important to have control over those. Smotrich made a plan. He did his homework. He figured out exactly which parts of the government he needed, which appointments to make, and he, came with a very long list to Netanyahu and said, "I want this, I want this, I want this." And so now the settlement movement, the national religious movement, is going to have control over the settlement enterprise. And then another thing that he'll have control over is not only the West Bank, but also the Gaza Strip, because these are the same aspects of the Israeli military that control the lives of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Specifically, if they want to come to the West Bank, if they need for hospitalization or to visit a family member, whatever the case is, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are completely dependent on the Israeli government for permission to travel from one part of Palestine to the other. That's also something Smotrich will be in charge of. And we can imagine, we can only, the tip of the iceberg of what he plans to do with that kind of power, but none of it's good. We're talking about someone who aspires to ethnically cleanse all the non-Jews in the country, so it's going to be dark days ahead.
Well, he's explicitly called Smotrich for tightening the noose on the Gaza Strip when he comes in. And then we also have Itamar Ben-Gvir declaring his intention to allow Jewish prayer on the Al-Aqsa compound, in the Al-Aqsa compound. This is a long-term goal of the temple movement and a faction within Kahanism that seems to be the most extreme within the entire Israeli political spectrum. It's essentially the Jewish ISIS. And you've done a lot of coverage of this movement. So what's going on here? There are already changes taking place on Al-Aqsa. The signs urging against Jewish prayer have been removed. Ben-Gvir has repeatedly been seen marching around the compound. But there is a larger plan. What is it, and how does it figure into the kind of messianic end game of these figures?
Well, for the Kahane movement, I wouldn't say it's a faction of them. I would say it's from the start, from the core, and it's throughout the movement, that their vision is to demolish the Al-Aqsa mosques and associated shrines on the compound, Haram al-Sharif, and to build there a very boring rectangular temple / abattoir. And I call it that because on Jewish holidays, and I've heard, I've filmed the leaders of this movement explaining it in precise detail, that on Jewish holidays, the priests will be up to their knees in blood. They will slaughter over 10,000 animals a day, on Passover, on Tabernacles, on the Festival of Weeks. So that's, they're going to create a massive slaughterhouse there. For this, they want to destroy the most beautiful building in historic Palestine. So the other thing about them is they try to destroy the mosques not only for their own sake, but also to start a war. Every time that Israel makes an effort to, or there's forces in Israel that bring it to the table to create some kind of compromise, whether it's with Egypt in the late 70s, the Kahanists tried to blow up Al-Aqsa in order to stop the Israel-Egypt peace deal, which involved Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. Same thing some years later, as you pointed out, when the Oslo Accords began. Then the Kahanist Baruch Goldstein this time assassinates people or mass murders people not on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, but the holy sites in Hebron, the Ibrahimi Mosque. So for Kahanists, the idea is by creating mass murder and destruction of sites that are holy to both Jews and Muslims and to make them only Jewish, on one hand, it's in order to explode the possibility of peace and ensure that Israel, returns to its path of, us against the world. But more than this, they want Israel to be the sole sovereign, not only in the territory that Israel currently occupies, but for Israel to expand and include all the countries around it, from Egypt to Iraq to Turkey, and then beyond. And they want for that entire area, as I said, not only to be ethnically cleansed, but for all of the Christian and Muslim houses of worship to be demolished, and for everyone to forsake their, because this is what they actually believe, and more so to the point, they believe in vengeance upon the non-Jews is a core component of they believe. They believe that, yes, one day there will be peace, but until then, God needs to pass judgment on the world and take revenge for all the sufferings of the Jews. They believe, as I mentioned, that killing non-Jews is a mitzvah. So these are the people that now have, their hands on the steering wheel of the state of Israel, if you can imagine that. So this movement at Al-Aqsa, in recent years, they've actually been accruing popularity. It used to be that they were considered fringe. It was just a few Kahanists, really, and a few other random crazies. But they worked very hard, as I said, to convert members of Knesset from the Likud party to support their cause, which they did successfully. Those members of the Likud went to bat with the police. Miri Regev, who is going to be perhaps Israel's education minister. This is someone who incited race riots against African refugees in the streets of Tel Aviv, as you well know, Max, 10 years ago. She's slated to be Israel's education minister, but a decade ago she was fighting in the Knesset to ensure that police would start allowing Jews to pray on the Temple Mount. And this is, the entire complex is a Muslim holy site, but for these Jews, they saw this as a way for these Templars, these Kahanists who want to destroy Al-Aqsa, they saw that this, by adopting a human rights discourse and saying, how can you not allow Jews to pray in the middle of a Muslim mosque? That's a discrimination against Jews. And she fought on this basis and pushed back against the police to the point where today police no longer enforce what was once the status quo, the idea that it's a Muslim holy site. It's also, an expansive courtyard in the middle of the old city of Jerusalem that is also holy to Jews. So Jews and also tourists are allowed to visit there when it's not prayer hours, but they're not allowed to start praying there and turn it into a Jewish place of worship. That was the status quo that has existed since 1967 when Israel conquered the site. So Miri Regev encouraged, and other members of Knesset from the Likud, putting pressure on the police, eventually the police starting to back off. So in recent years, we see more and more the police permitting, just standing by and no longer arresting and removing from the site Jews who openly, brazenly make a point of not just walking around and muttering under their breaths, prayers to Yahweh, but openly, hoisting an Israeli flag they snuck in, or singing the anthem, or praying, or lying down on the ground and bowing. It's not that they're trying to fight for the right to pray. They're fighting for the right to slaughter 10,000 plus animals a day there and to turn Israel into a theocracy in which they will prosecute anyone who violates the Sabbath in public. They are very serious about their theocratic dominionist agenda. And frankly, it's hard to think otherwise when the same Netanyahu government coming in is, amongst other things, we talked about all the things he's giving, all the things he's granting to Smotrich and to Ben-Gvir, but we didn't talk about the other members of his coalition, the other ultra-Orthodox parties who've demanded increased budgets for their school systems that don't teach English and math. So this is essentially, just as Netanyahu is now dismembering the Israeli security forces in a way, and so now he's doing the same thing to Israel's educational system. So there already are religious streams, but now he's completely funding the ultra-Orthodox streams that take youth and do not teach them math and do not teach them English and only teach them racist, sexist, homophobic religious texts and leave them with no skills to make a living in the modern world. That means that we've essentially we farmed out everything. We farmed out the military, we farmed out the education system. This is the reason that a lot of those the few liberals that are left in Israel are pulling out what little hair they have, because for them this is the end of the Israel that they once knew, the appearance of anything but apartheid. Now the mask has come down, so people are, I don't know if they're heading for the airports, but certainly people of a younger age who see what's happening around them, most of them are electing to leave if they have a shred of decency left. Those that are staying either are Palestinians or are making their bed. Of course, there's a few people who are resisting, but as you've seen in recent years, their numbers are dwindling. In the most recent election, we saw, in fact, the complete evaporation of the only liberal Zionist party in the Knesset, the Meretz party, where they once had 5% of the Israeli electorate. This time, after when they first came onto the stage in 1992, they were a major part of the Rabin government that initiated the Oslo Accord process with the Palestinians, for good and for bad. This election, they were completely wiped off the map. They don't exist as a political force anymore. So what's left? We're going to see everything spiral downwards. And I frankly don't imagine that anything is going to happen in the way of major condemnation from the White House. We've already known for quite a while that the Kahanists run the roost here, and the Biden administration hasn't given any signals of, that the winds
that's what I was going to
changed.
ask you next. Ask you about next. The Biden administration, or actually Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, did address this issue at a conference of the liberal Zionist group J Street here in Washington. And Blinken, who has been a long time supporter and basically a tool of AIPAC, who told a meeting of AIPAC back in 2007 that his support for Israel's strength was inherited from his family, specifically referring to the father-in-law, Samuel Pisar, who raised him, who was a leader of the French Israel lobby. Blinken said that he will judge Israel by its policies and not its personalities, referring to Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And to me, this essentially gives Netanyahu a free pass to appoint them and other Kahanists. And Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, Democrat who's close to Biden, has said that the Biden administration is quietly working behind the scenes to limit the influence of Kahanist figures. So they're quiet and they're not going to denounce the personalities. What do you make of that?
I mean, it's hard to hold back the nausea, because this is, first of all, let's talk about the Democratic Party. They have long been in bed with the Kahanists. It's more, especially the case in New York State, in New York City, but for decades it's already been the case across the country. The number one funder of the Kahana movement in Israel, including its terrorist wing, is also the number one funder of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's also the funder of several Democrat members of Congress, and lots of Republican members of Congress too, but also the Democrats. And this is a tradition that's gone back for some time now. The Democrats, some of the leading members of the party in the New York area, have depended upon the most racist rabbis in New York, specifically Kahana's biggest supporters, both when he was alive and after he died, supporters of his followers. In fact, including the rabbis who held the annual Kahana memorial services every single year in New York City. These rabbis are held up and hoisted by Democratic Party officials as spiritual mentors. I mean, going back to the 1970s, 80s, 90s, it was throughout. And it's still today. The only synagogue that has ever hosted a meeting of Congress was at the synagogue that hosted the memorials to Kahane. Okay, so the amount of power that they've had is, you know, frightening. And okay, it's not that they, you know, completely have total control over the Democratic Party, but they don't need to have total control of the Democratic Party because AIPAC already has control over most of it. They only need to be pushing to the right, just like Ben-Gvir. Just as Ben-Gvir doesn't even need to be in government to affect the government. They've long been pulling it to the far right. Now they just have more power. And it's the same thing with the Kahanists. The easiest way to see this, just as one small example, is think of a Jewish community issue that wasn't an issue at all and was actually a source of embarrassment for most American Jews until the Kahanists made it an important issue. What was that? The spy Jonathan Pollard. When the Israeli spy, the American CIA analyst who spied for Israel was caught and punished and sentenced to jail, most American Jews wanted nothing to do with Pollard. Didn't want to be associated with him. Didn't think of him as a hero, as he wasn't. But the Kahanists, you know, held him up as a hero, and they actually, the killer of Alex Odeh, one of the killers of Alex Odeh, who was Ben-Gvir's mentor, Baruch Ben Yosef, actually was the first lawyer for Pollard, suing Benjamin Netanyahu in Israeli court, in the Supreme Court, demanding that he take responsibility for Pollard. Of course, Israel's government later did take responsibility. As soon as he got out of jail, Netanyahu, you know, he was brought to jail by Netanyahu's funder, Sheldon Adelson, and of course Netanyahu welcomed him, and he's now, you know, back in the arms of his Kahanist supporters here in Israel. But if you think about it, Jonathan Pollard was never an issue for 99.9% of American Jews and American New Yorkers specifically. But the Kahane movement hatched on that issue at a time when they realized they had lots of leverage. In the late 1990s, when Hillary Clinton was running to be the senator of New York State, and she was identified as a carpetbagger because she'd never lived in New York State, so she was vulnerable to political pressures. The Kahanists threw everything at her, and they're, of course, main political, you know, trustee in New York State, the former JDL terrorist, the former Kahanist terrorist Dov Heikind, was the point man, but the Kahanists, you know, including Rabbi Avi Weiss and others, all put pressure on the Hillary Clinton camp in order to, you know, force her further and further to the right. If, you know, she had previously, like her husband, who had made, you know, helped make peace, or at least sign a peace accord between Israel's Prime Minister Rabin and PLO leader Yasser Arafat. So if she had cautiously supported the peacemaking efforts of her husband and called for the establishment of a Palestinian state, saying that it would be in the long-term interests of the region, the Kahanists, you know, just smeared her as an anti-Semite, as an Israel hater, as a, you know, and she buckled and she caved. And in the end, you know, she chased after the Kahanists, looking, please, would the Kahanists please endorse me? Please, Dov Heikind, would you please tell people to vote for me? And she, you know, essentially sucked up to him to the point where she's like, oh, okay, I'll make and she made an announcement urging her husband to grant clemency, or, you know, to support the cause of Jonathan Pollard, which was an insane ask. But this is just one example. And of course, that times a million other political decisions that all kinds of politicians in New York and other parts of the US and around the world are made every day. And instead of, you know, dismissing the ramblings of incoherent Kahanists who want them to take one political position or another, saying, you are out and out racists, I'm not listening to anything you say, and I'm not determining what is Jew hatred and wasn't Jew hatred based on your twisted opinion. Instead, politicians from even the strongest political family in the Democratic camp sucked up to the Kahanists and tried to elicit support from them so that they would have, you know, their vote. And so this is just emblematic of the fact that despite they are a fringe movement in the sense that they have very few supporters in the Jewish community, but they're very loud and powerful and persistent. And they have managed, with their persistence and their focus, to actually steer US politics, and certainly now to completely grab the steering wheel on Israeli politics.
And Dov Hikind, who you mentioned, the former terrorist Jewish Defense League leader and acolyte of Meir Kahane, a co-conspirator with Meir Kahane, who carried out firebombing attacks, for example, on Soviet diplomats, remains an assembly member and a member of the Democratic Party in New York. So these figures are still among us. With David Sheen, where can we find more of your work on these issues, and what are you planning in the future?
Well, it's really easy to find me. I'm at davidsheen.com, and from there you can see all my articles, all my videos, my YouTube channel, and other social media handles. In recent years, I've published tens of thousands of words on these very topics, and I've also given lectures, several different lectures on different aspects of the Kahane movement. So easy to find at davidsheen.com. And what's happening next? It's difficult to say. I'm still here in Haifa. I'm not going anywhere. Going down with the ship, I don't know. The Palestinians that I know are staying, no matter how bad it gets. From their perspective, the people that I've spoken to at least, they're just like, we've seen these regimes go and come and go, and we'll stay fast to our land, and we'll see this Zionist regime go as well. But I'm still here, and thankfully, I'm still alive and healthy. But if you want to see more of this kind of journalism, then you're very welcome to hit up my Patreon and PayPal as well. Also, all linked at davidsheen.com. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, and I definitely encourage everyone watching to support David in any way you can. He's one of the few independent journalists doing this kind of quality work and exposing these elements in such a clinical and methodical way. So thanks for joining us at the Grayzone, David.
Thanks for having me, Max. Good to be here. Take care.
Take care. And I'm Max Blumenthal. This was another episode of the Grayzone. You can support us at patreon.com/Grayzone. Follow us at thegrayzone.com and on YouTube for as long as we're there. Thanks for joining us.